Nadira, Desmond, and Callista, three names once bound by faith, family, and trust, would soon be at the center of a scandal so vile it would tear their world apart. Nadira, the devoted pastor's wife, carried a secret no prayer could erase. Desmond, her daughter's husband, was drowning in the weight of a betrayal he could no longer hide. And Callista, the woman who had once believed in love and loyalty, was about to uncover a truth so devastating it would shatter not just her marriage, but an entire church. Nadira Hensley and her husband, Pastor Elias Hensley, had built their lives around faith, family, and their church. Holy Grace Church was more than just a place of worship. It was a sanctuary for hundreds of devoted followers who looked to the couple for spiritual guidance. Elias was a charismatic leader, delivering passionate sermons that left his congregation inspired. Nadira stood beside him as the perfect wife, always graceful, always supportive, and always present. To those who attended the church, they were an example of God's love, a couple deeply in tune with their faith and one another. Their daughter, Callista, embodied the values her parents had instilled in her. She had grown up surrounded by church gatherings, prayer meetings, and scripture readings. She was a woman of strong faith, admired for her kindness and devotion. Her marriage to Desmond Pierce, a respected businessman, seemed like the perfect union. Together for 5 years, Callista and Desmond were the kind of couple others envied. They spoke lovingly of their future, their dreams of raising children, and their belief that God would soon bless them with a family. But beneath the surface of this seemingly ideal life, cracks had begun to form. Callista, blinded by her faith in her marriage, ignored the growing distance between herself and Desmond. His business kept him away more often, his work trips becoming more frequent, his presence in their home less consistent. When he was home, he was distracted, lost in his phone, or preoccupied with other matters. Callista reassured herself that it was simply a busy season for him, that soon things would settle, and they would focus on their dream of starting a family. Nadira, too, was experiencing a shift in her own marriage. While she and Elias had once been a strong, united couple, something had changed in their dynamic. The love that once filled their home had faded into something cold and distant. Elias, once an attentive husband, had grown detached. He was still a powerful leader in the church, but at home he barely spoke to her. Nadira often found herself alone, trying to keep up appearances for the congregation while feeling more isolated than ever. The weight of her position as the pastor's wife was heavy, and she felt trapped in the image she was expected to uphold. Despite these unspoken tensions, Nadira and Callista remained close. Callista often invited her mother to her home for long conversations, sharing her thoughts, her worries, and her hopes for the future. She confided in Nadira about her struggles with conception, her concern that time was slipping away, and her frustration that Desmond didn't seem as invested as he once was. Nadira comforted her, telling her to be patient, that God's timing was always perfect. But what Callista didn't know was that Nadira carried a secret of her own. She had found solace in Desmond's company more times than she cared to admit. What had started as innocent conversations about Callista's worries had turned into something else, something neither of them had planned. In the moments when Desmond returned from his trips, when Callista wasn't home, Nadira had been there. She had been the one listening to him, the one offering him comfort. Desmond had confided in Nadira in ways he never had with Callista. He spoke of his frustrations, his dissatisfaction, his need for something more. Nadira, longing for attention and affection, had been drawn to his words. She told herself it was harmless, that she was simply helping her daughter's husband navigate his struggles. But over time, the line between right and wrong blurred, and they crossed into dangerous territory. Neither of them had wanted this, but neither of them had stopped it either. It was a secret that could never come to light, one that could destroy everything if exposed, and yet, despite knowing the risks, they continued their deception, believing that as long as they were careful, no one would ever find out. Callista remained blissfully unaware. She held on to her faith in both her marriage and her family, trusting that love would triumph over any hardships they faced. She prayed for a child, for healing in her marriage, for the bond between her parents to strengthen once more. She never questioned the time her mother and husband spent together, never considered the possibility of betrayal. But secrets had a way of revealing themselves, no matter how well hidden. And in the months to come, the deception that had taken root in the Hensley family would unravel in a way none of them could have imagined. Nadira had always believed in discipline, restraint, and the importance of maintaining her image as the pastor's wife. Yet, as the weeks passed, her guilt began to weigh on her like an unbearable burden. She tried to convince herself that what had happened between her and Desmond was a mistake, a moment of weakness that would never be repeated. She prayed for forgiveness, begged God for mercy, and swore to herself that she would put an end to it. But temptation had already taken hold, and the more she tried to resist, the more she found herself slipping deeper into the forbidden affair. Desmond, on the other hand, showed no signs of regret. If anything, his desire for Nadira only grew stronger. His marriage to Callista had become an obligation rather than a partnership, and he no longer felt the warmth he once had for his wife. When he looked at Nadira, he saw a woman who understood him in ways Callista never could. She was mature, sophisticated, and most importantly, she made him feel wanted. His attraction to her was undeniable, and no matter how much she tried to push him away, he always found a way to pull her back in. What had started as stolen glances and whispered confessions soon escalated into something neither of them could control. Desmond began making excuses to see Nadira more often, arranging secret meetings at the church when no one was around, sneaking into her home when Elias was busy preparing sermons or attending religious conferences. Their encounters became riskier, their lies more elaborate, but the thrill of it all made them reckless. Despite their best efforts to keep their affair hidden, Nadira's behavior began to change in ways that did not go unnoticed. She became more distant at church, her once radiant smile now forced, her words lacking the conviction they once held. She avoided Elias as much as possible, finding reasons to leave the house early and return late. Her friends at the church noticed the shift in her demeanor, whispering amongst themselves about how the pastor's wife seemed troubled, but no one dared to question her directly. Callista, too, started to sense something was off, though she couldn't quite put her finger on what it was. She attributed her mother's odd behavior to stress, believing that perhaps she and Elias were going through a rough patch. But what troubled her the most was Desmond's increasing coldness toward her. He had always been affectionate, always, made time for her despite his busy schedule. Now he barely looked at her, barely spoke to her unless necessary. She told herself it was just a phase, that marriage had its ups and downs, and that eventually they would find their way back to each other. But the truth was far more sinister than she could have imagined. One evening, as Nadira stood in front of the bathroom mirror, she felt a wave of nausea wash over her. It was the third time that week she had felt this way, but she had ignored it, convincing herself it was nothing more than stress. Yet, as she gripped the sink, her body trembling, a horrifying realization began to settle in. Her cycle was late, not just by a few days, but by weeks. Panic set in. She couldn't be pregnant. It wasn't possible, but deep down, she knew the truth. She had been careless, believing that her age had made pregnancy unlikely. She had thought she was safe. Now, the consequences of her actions were staring her in the face, threatening to destroy everything she had spent her entire life building. She knew she had to confirm it, so the next day, she drove to a neighboring town where no one would recognize her and bought a pregnancy test. Sitting in a gas station restroom, her hands shaking, she watched as the test confirmed her worst fear. She was pregnant. Her mind raced with questions, with possible explanations, with ways she could fix this before it was too late. But there was no solution that wouldn't end in disaster. If the truth came out, it wouldn't just be her reputation at stake, It would be the destruction of her family, her marriage, and the church itself. There was only one question that mattered now. What was she going to do? Nadira could barely breathe as she drove home, her hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly, her knuckles turned white. The test sat in the passenger seat beside her, the two pink lines burning into her mind like a scar she could never erase. This wasn't just a mistake she could pray away. It was real, undeniable proof of her betrayal, growing inside her with every passing day. For the first time in her life, Nadira felt truly alone. There was no one she could confide in, no one she could turn to for guidance. Elias would never forgive her if he knew the truth. The church would condemn her. Callista, sweet, innocent Callista, would be shattered beyond repair. And Desmond, he could destroy everything if he handled the news the wrong way. She wanted to pretend it wasn't happening, to believe that if she ignored it long enough, it would simply go away. But her body refused to let her forget. The nausea, the exhaustion, the changes she could already feel creeping in told her that this was only the beginning. For days, she wrestled with what to do. She considered keeping it a secret forever, finding a way to hide the pregnancy until she could make it disappear. But as much as she wanted to believe she could control the situation, she knew that time wasn't on her side. Eventually, someone would notice. And when they did, the questions would begin. Desmond was the first to sense something was wrong. He had always been observant, always able to read Nadira in ways others couldn't. Lately, she had been more distant, more anxious. She barely looked at him when they were alone. And when he reached for her, she flinched as if his touch burned. At first, he thought she was trying to end things between them. The guilt was finally getting to her, and she was pulling away before it all crumbled around them. But then, one evening, as he watched her move around the church during a community gathering, he saw something that made his stomach twist. Nadira pressed a hand to her lower abdomen, her face pale, her movements slower than usual. It was subtle, but it was enough. A sickening thought crept into his mind, and once it took root, he couldn't shake it. The next day, he confronted her, cornering her in the back of the church when no one else was around. Nadira's heart pounded as he demanded to know the truth, his voice low but urgent. She tried to lie, to brush it off, to tell him he was imagining things. But Desmond wasn't a fool. He could see the fear in her eyes, the hesitation in her words. And when she finally broke down, when she whispered the truth he had been dreading, the weight of it nearly knocked him off his feet. He wasn't angry. He wasn't even shocked. Somewhere deep down, he had already known. But knowing the truth and facing it were two very different things. A baby changed everything. It wasn't just their secret anymore. It was a life that had no place in the world they had built. Desmond's mind raced through the possibilities, each one more disastrous than the last. If Callista found out, she would never forgive them. If Elias found out, he would ruin them both. And the church would never accept a scandal like this. Nadira wasn't just any woman. She was the pastor's wife. She was supposed to be a pillar of morality, a beacon of righteousness. If word got out, there would be no redemption for either of them. Nadira was barely holding herself together, her hands shaking as she clutched at her stomach, as if she could will the child. Away with sheer desperation, she pleaded with Desmond, begged him to help her figure out a way to make this go away before it was too late. For the first time since their affair began, Desmond hesitated. He had always been able to manipulate situations to his advantage, always been able to charm his way out of trouble. But this was different. There was no smooth escape, no way to undo what they had done. The weight of their sin was no longer just a secret between two people. It was living proof of their betrayal, and it would not remain hidden for long. Nadira spent her nights staring at the ceiling, unable to sleep, unable to think of anything except the growing weight of her secret. The days blurred together, each one passing with unbearable slowness. Yet at the same time, she felt as though she was running out of time. The longer she waited, the more impossible it became to hide. She could feel the changes in her body now, small but undeniable signs that life was growing inside her. Every morning, she woke up with nausea that left her weak and trembling. Every night she lay in bed, dreading what would happen if someone found out. Desmond was just as restless. He had always been a man who thrived on control, someone who could manipulate a situation to his advantage, but this was beyond him. He couldn't undo what had been done, couldn't charm his way out of this one. The weight of it pressed down on him, suffocating and unrelenting. He avoided Callista more than ever, unable to look at her without feeling the crushing guilt of what he had done. Every time she spoke to him, every time she reached for his hand, it felt like a reminder of the betrayal that lurked beneath the surface. The church community was oblivious, but Nadira knew that wouldn't last forever. She had spent years playing the role of the perfect pastor's wife, a woman devoted to her husband, her faith, and her family. But now, every sermon, every prayer, every forced smile felt like a lie. The walls of the church, once a place of comfort, now felt like a prison. Every Sunday, as she sat beside Elias, pretending to listen to his sermons, she could feel the weight of her sin crushing her. Elias, of course, remained blind to it all. He was too focused on his work, too caught up in his responsibilities to notice the changes in his wife. He assumed her exhaustion was due to stress, perhaps even fasting or late-night prayer. He never questioned the way her hands trembled when she held her Bible, or why she had started covering her stomach with loose-fitting clothes. He was too trusting, too devoted to his faith to ever suspect his wife of such betrayal. But Callista was different. She had always been perceptive, always able to sense when something was wrong. And now, she was beginning to notice things she couldn't ignore. It started with the way her mother avoided her. Nadira had always been close to Callista, offering advice, support, and encouragement. But now, she was distant. She barely made eye contact, barely spoke unless necessary. Whenever Callista entered the room, she saw her mother stiffen, as if she was afraid of being too close. At first, she thought she had done something wrong, but then she started noticing the same behavior from Desmond. Desmond, who had once been so affectionate, so present, was now withdrawn. He barely looked at her when they were alone, and when she reached for him, he pulled away. The passion they once shared had vanished, replaced by cold distance. She told herself it was just stress, that maybe he was going through something he wasn't ready to talk about. But deep down, a feeling of unease began to grow. Then, one evening, as she was helping her mother clean up after a church event, she saw something that made her stomach drop. Nadira had been bending down to pick up a chair when her blouse shifted, slightly. It was only for a second, but it was enough. A small but noticeable swell beneath her clothing. Callista's breath caught in her throat. She told herself she was imagining it, that it was just the way the fabric had moved. But once she saw it, she couldn't unsee it. The nausea, the exhaustion, the way Nadira had been dressing differently, it all made sense now. Her mother was pregnant. The realization sent a wave of confusion through her. Elias and Nadira hadn't had a child in years. They had never mentioned wanting another. It didn't make sense. But before she could question it, a far darker thought crept into her mind, one that made her blood run cold. Desmond, the way he had been acting, the way he and Nadira had been avoiding each other, the guilt that flickered in his eyes whenever she looked at him. No, it couldn't be. It wasn't possible. But as she stood there, watching her mother carefully adjust her blouse as if she knew she had been caught, Callista realized that the truth was far worse than she had ever imagined. Callista felt her world shatter around her. The realization struck her like a violent storm, tearing through everything she had ever believed about love, trust, and family. She tried to push the thought away, to convince herself she was overreacting, but the pieces of the puzzle were already fitting together too perfectly. The signs had been there all along, the secrecy, the strange tension, the way both Nadira and Desmond had changed in ways she couldn't explain. And now, the undeniable proof was growing inside her mother's body. She told herself she needed more than suspicion. She needed to be sure. But deep down, she already knew the truth. The thought of confronting them made her stomach turn, but she couldn't live with the weight of this secret. She had to expose them, no matter the consequences. The following Sunday, Callista sat in church, barely able to focus as Elias delivered his sermon. Her hands trembled as she clutched her Bible, her heart pounding so loudly she could barely hear the words being spoken. Desmond sat beside her, rigid and silent, his fingers locked together as if he were holding himself in place. Across the room, Nadira avoided looking in their direction, her expression carefully composed but visibly tense. Callista watched them both, anger boiling inside her. How long had they planned to keep this secret? Had they thought they could hide it forever? Had they truly believed she was so blind, so naive? By the time the service ended, Callista had made her decision. She waited until they were home, waited until the house was quiet, then cornered Nadira in the kitchen. Her mother's face went pale as soon as she saw the look in Callista's eyes. There was no need for words. The truth was already laid bare, between them. Nadira tried to deny it, but the fear in her eyes betrayed her. Callista's voice shook as she demanded answers, but Nadira had none to give. There was no justification, no explanation that could make this right. She had betrayed not only Elias, but her own daughter. She had destroyed everything their family had been built upon. Desmond was next. When Callista confronted him, he didn't even try to lie. He simply stood there, his silence a confession of everything he had done. He looked at her with something that almost resembled regret, but it was too late. He had crossed a line that could never be undone. Callista felt as if she had been set on fire, the rage inside her consuming everything. She couldn't let them get away with this. She wouldn't be the one who stayed silent while their betrayal went unpunished. She had spent her life believing in the strength of her family, in the righteousness of the church, but now she saw the truth. It had all been a lie. She made sure the truth wouldn't stay hidden. It started with whispers, quiet conversations with the church elders, a confession made in tears. The scandal spread like wildfire, and within days, it was no longer a secret. The congregation was horrified. The pastor's wife, carrying another man's child, a trusted member of the church, betraying both his wife and his faith. Elias was the last to know. He heard the rumors before Callista could tell him herself, and when the truth finally reached him, it was as if the ground beneath him had vanished. The man who had preached about faith, marriage, and loyalty now stood humiliated before the very people he had led for years. The fallout was brutal. Nadira was cast out of the church, her name spoken in hushed, disgusted tones. Desmond was stripped of his standing, his reputation left in ruins. Callista left him without a second thought, knowing she could never look at him the same way again. Elias, broken and humiliated, stepped down from his position. The church that had once been his life turned its back on him, unable to reconcile. The scandal with the image of righteousness he had once upheld. Nadira gave birth in isolation, far from the home she had once known. There was no celebration, no joy in the arrival of the child. It was a living reminder of everything that had been lost. Callista, forever changed, walked away from it all. She no longer believed in the perfect world she had once trusted so blindly. The truth had destroyed everything, but in the end, it had set her free.